We are a nation of builders and of creators. We are growers and we are harvesters. We make the deserts bloom, and together we can go anywhere. Our future is yet undetermined. Those who came before us laid down foundations that we could either build upon or abandon. Great gifts of wisdom from the past, a civilization to defend, and new horizons to conquer. Traveling back into the unknown reaches of time, when early man was a nomad, we could not easily overcome the harsh elements of nature and build a civilization. A tremendous amount of our limited time and energy was spent on simply struggling to survive and overcoming the odds to procreate and start again, like a golden chain stretching into eternity. Out of the primitive wandering came the desire for stability, the awareness that only by staying in one place and putting down roots were we able to build lives of lasting permanence, passing on to our future progeny the foundations of structure, order, dominion, wisdom, and sustenance. And so, from these higher impulses, the state was born, which was organized around the decrees of divine ordinance known as law. And when governance proved efficacious, it expanded, often without violence, into an empire. There is a reason that Evola chose to group these three topics into one chapter, and that is because they are all closely related and interdependent. God communes with the king. The king declares the divine laws as communicated to him by God. The state is born by a decree of the law. The state itself is an extension of the law, an organization of hierarchy around the principles expounded by the law, and when the state succeeds, it expands into an empire. The state, from the same root word as static, stasis, and to stay, in its most fundamental sense, expressed the urge to construct something of lasting value, a unifying idea that gathered the disparate energies of a nomadic people and centered their creative forces into a focal point that allowed the efforts of successive generations to aggregate towards a better future. Evola makes a reference to the idea of the axis mundi, the center of the world, and notes that symbols of centrality and polarity are related to the state as much as they are related to the archetype of the king. Often represented by a sacred stone or a high point such as a mountain or constructed temple, the omphalos symbolized a connection between the earth and the heavens. This sacred center represents a microcosm of order and outside its boundaries lies chaos. As the king radiates logos from his being, so too does the state radiate logos, due in part to the presence of the king, but also as a larger, more encompassing symbol of order and stability. Thus, the axis mundi is represented throughout the world of tradition, not only in the form of the true king who, by virtue of residing at this center, has access to the supernatural knowledge of the divine, but also as a physical geographic location around which a state was constructed. The creation of a state frees up man's time and energy to pursue higher purposes beyond mere survival. The state allows us to conquer nature so that we are not forever combating it in order to live another day. The stability and security provided by the state allow for the leisure time to develop advanced spirituality, philosophy, art, and more. When man is perpetually subjected to the vicissitudes of nature, such as weather or even war, he becomes stuck in a naturalistic state, and his spirituality remains oriented around and connected to nature because he cannot conceive of anything transcendent beyond it. It is fashionable among some modern people to be anti-state, as they see the state as an impediment to their liberty, although what they often call liberty would be more rightly referred to as licentiousness. For those who seek to engage in hedonistic materialism and indulge their baser natures, the concept of the state that Evola describes may be extremely off-putting, as the traditional state is meant to create a societal structure that steers people away from such decadence. Evola says that the purpose of the state is to free us from impediments in order to realize our highest transcendent potential, as it provides a structure upon which the king can arise, govern, and provide a central stability that is an expression of hierarchy, and not simply an example of a merely earthly and temporal nature that is human, all too human. All of the higher aspects that man aspires to ascend to can be realized through a state that is in line with the will of God and the expression of what a people can collectively aspire to. The state becomes the collected creation of all the enacted wisdom of centuries of people, preserving it and allowing us to take the jewels of knowledge and enact them in our own lives, surrounded by others who are all doing the same thing. Some might also criticize the modern state as being an obstacle for those who do wish to aspire to transcendent heights. We look upon the disastrous leaders of today and find them to be lacking as they legislate against the natural cosmic order and create a world of ugliness and sin where the globalized, homogenized mass culture lifts up no one but threatens to drag us all down in its decadent undertow. Evola makes a reference back to the doctrine of the two natures, which was discussed in the beginning of the book, and says that this is reflected in the relationship between the state and the people, for which he uses the Greek word demos, and he says, "The idea that the state derives its origins from the demos, and that the principle of its legitimacy and its foundation rests upon it, is an ideological perversion typical of the modern world, and essentially represents a regression. With this view, we regress to what was typical of naturalistic social forms, lacking an authentic spiritual chrism. Once this direction was taken, an inevitable downward spiraling occurred, which ended with the triumph of the collectivistic world of the masses and with the advent of radical democracy. This regression proceeds from a logical necessity and from the physical law of gravity that affects falling bodies." The traditional view, however, held the opposite principle. in that the state was related to the people in the same way that the superior metaphysical world of being relates to the inferior material world of becoming, and that the tension between these two poles of state and demos was resolved by the establishment of divine order. The demos naturally resists the aristocracy, as each attempts to fully create the society they want. This desire to go in opposite directions creates a polar tension. The masses always feel that the aristocracy will only serve their own selfish interests and create wealth only for themselves, which is indeed the case in modern times. But a true aristocracy is not a mere financial one, but one that has a divine connection and will act through the state to create an ideal social structure that will survive through generations, and with the purpose of raising everyone up through a law and order that is dharmic in nature. When the transfiguration from the order from above occurs, and the state is manifested in its perfect glory with no resistance anymore, the tension of the masses is resolved in the exuberance and beatitude they feel in the celebration of being in touch with their own divine natures. Thus, the state is required in order to overcome the chaos of the inferior nature of the people. This is the basis of the idea of the caste system, at least in terms of spiritually based castes rather than physically based castes. The purpose of castes was not to enslave anyone, but to help them fulfill their potential in the role most suited to their ontological nature, and to help everyone feel as though they are a part of something greater. When a person fulfills their role in their caste, they boost the power of the principle of light here on earth in the domain proper to him. Under the rule of a true king in a state aligned with Dharma, a person would take pride in performing his role well, knowing that he was an integral part of a divinely ordained hierarchy. Evola refers to the polarity between the Arya and the Shudra. The Arya were the nobles, or twice born, that is, those who were awakened, usually through initiatic rites, who represented the divine element, while the Shudra belonged to nature and an earthly animalistic substratum of the hierarchy. It was the role of the upper castes to lift up the lower castes to be better than what they were, so that they too could achieve some transcendent connection. The accomplishment of the state to lift people up towards a higher purpose permeated throughout the caste system. In some cases, this failed to occur, possibly because the focus degenerated into addressing material problems such as poverty, rather than adhering to a strictly spiritual path. This brings us to the traditional idea of law. Unlike in modern times, where most laws are designed to serve political and economic interests, the laws of the world of tradition were intended to keep people connected to the divine and help them stay on a path that would lead them closer to God. Evola writes, "Generally speaking, a transcendent realism is the presupposition of the traditional notion of the law. Especially in Aryan formulations, the notion of law has an intimate relationship with the notions of truth, reality, and stability inherent to that which is." In other words, the law was meant to be a reflection of the metaphysical cosmic order. In the previous chapter, Evola spoke of the philosopher king as being one who knows that which is. That is, one who has knowledge of the true metaphysical world, and the one who can formulate laws that correspond to dharmic justice, because of his direct knowledge of that which is supremely real. In the world of tradition, the laws handed down by the king corresponded as closely as possible to that which is. Breaking the law was equivalent to committing a sin. The original meaning of the word sin was error. It was not so much that in breaking the law or committing a sin, one had violated a merely criminal code, but rather that through their transgression, one had become an enemy of their own true nature, that they had separated themselves from God. The true victim of their crime was themselves. In the words of St. Augustine, a sin is a word, deed, or desire in opposition to the eternal law. This may be the origin of the idea that ignorance of the law is no defense, as the law in the traditional world would have aligned with our conscience. Our conscience longs for us to live in a holy state in line with our true nature, but sometimes the ego that is grafted onto our soul may want different things than our true self, the eternal part of us that is a piece of God. We can violate natural law, but when we do, we are committing violence against our own being. And this comes with a feeling of sadness or guilt afterwards, if we are paying attention and reflect on our actions. Our soul's vibrational frequency, our conscience, will tell us if our actions were true, pure, and just, and in line with Dharma, or if we have separated ourselves from God in some way. Thus, only laws that are written in accordance with this high vibrational frequency are laws we feel we can respect. Eventually, there came a split when the distinction was drawn between laws that served the interests of religion versus laws that served the interests of the city, and religiously oriented laws came to be seen as obstacles rather than safeguards. Modern laws are perhaps better thought of as regulations rather than laws, as they attempt to regulate our lives in order to serve various political, social, and economic agendas, but do nothing to help us live more meaningful lives. Many of these regulations feel silly or controlling, and we argue for or against their usefulness. Evola says that this concept of the usefulness of the law is very modern and anti-traditional. Traditional laws may have sometimes been utilitarian, but it was only as a side effect, not the main purpose, which was to orient everyone towards the transcendent will. The idea that a law had some kind of authority merely because it had been voted on or accepted by some parliament would have been foreign to tradition. When these man-made rules go against the natural order, they feel unjust, and there is no longer any sense of allegiance to the law. Laws which are unnatural in this regard will not stand the test of time. It is interesting to note that when there is a deteriorating morality of the population at large, the government begins to create more and more laws, but they are obeyed less and less as the people are committed to moral decadence. Such laws will never be widely recognized as having any kind of higher authority. Part of the reason for the modern demand for more and more legislation is the obsession our modern minds have with the usefulness of everything. We want laws that make sense and have some obvious practical value. But the purpose of traditional law that was handed down from the divine was not always obvious, and this was simply accepted on the grounds that the web of heaven's way is complex and incomprehensible. Thus, when examining traditional law, our minds will encounter things that run contrary to our modern conditioning, and we will start to question the usefulness of such a law. And when no obvious utilitarian purpose is found, we will decide it is something we should rebel against. But in the world of tradition, it was accepted that sometimes one must follow a law that appears to make no sense, because once it was established that a law had a divine origin, coming via the sacred king or his legislators, The people simply trusted in the mysterious ways of God and knew that it was somehow what was best for them. When we deny the laws of the divine, we reject Logos, and when we reject Logos, we find nothing but misery. Violating these laws can sometimes provide a temporary feeling of elation or excitement, but fast will come the repercussion. Just as a pyramid can only briefly balance on its point before falling flat again, so too can Logos only be briefly inverted before it attempts to right itself again. The natural order has supreme gravity and will always pull things back to how they should be. Those who choose to live out of alignment with the natural cosmic order live karmically sad lives. Every expression of what they are is an expression against Dharma. They make themselves intentionally ugly and offensive, and such a nature is subject to quick decay, as these inversions of Logos have little staying power in the grand scheme of things. We live in an age where natural rights are considered the source of law, but Evola says such rights are anti-traditional and subversive. This modern notion is the source of the ideology of individualism, which is against the natural order because it cannot help a person achieve spiritual liberation. It is choosing to go through life entirely on one's own, without any guru or authoritative guidance from one who has successfully walked the path before. Instead, everyone wants the right to live as they please, with little regard to whether or not it poisons their own soul or the souls of those around them. In the Kali Yuga, an age of brutal and corrupt governments, individual rights become important because they are a necessary division of power to slow the spread of evil, and our individual rights in the dark age of modernity do allow us the freedom to pursue a spiritually fulfilling path, even if we must do it as urban monks, surrounded by the listless inhabitants of a concrete jungle. However, the idea of individual rights, even if beneficial in the modern age, is still anti-traditional because it would not be viewed that way in the world of tradition where the aristocracy was benevolent. We have been programmed to reject these traditional ideas, and yet they often feel like a recovered memory to us. The successful union of law and state, when led by a sacred king, would lead then to an empire. We can see a modern, if distorted, example of this in the Catholic Church, where we have the church leader, the Pope, still referred to as Pontifex, that builder of transcendent bridges. And the idea of the infallibility of the Pope is an extension of the traditional idea of divine legislation being handed down through a king. Catholicism, for all its modern imperfections, is a properly oriented religion in that it has that traditional centrality and vertical orientation. The reason Catholicism developed in this way is partially due to the fact that any such urges in man do eventually find their way back to perennial truths, and the reason a religion succeeds is because it reflects those perennial truths. We are naturally inclined to seek that out because when we are aligned with perennial truth, we feel more internally resolved and more purposeful. The Catholic Church contains many echoes of tradition, and many pillars of traditional thought have been enshrined in Catholic canon over the centuries. Later versions of Christianity lack the richness and tradition of the Catholic Church, which has an entire theological and philosophical history to fall back on, rather than just the Bible. The Gnostic versions of Catholicism, despite containing vast traditional wisdom, failed to flourish because they lacked an imperial element through their failure to proselytize. Because of proselytization, Catholicism was able to become the religion of an existing empire, gaining for itself its own imperial element. Evola says that every state that arises has some connection to the dharmic principle of law, but sometimes this is a weak or imperfect connection due to the material reality of having to manifest within the realm of matter and time, and thus any weaknesses in the application of these ideas is due to the imperfect reflection of the metaphysical form that these ideas represent. For this reason, we can see perennial tradition expressed throughout many different cultures and ages, despite differences in the application or relative success of each attempt. The empire is the highest manifestation of the idea of the state, taken to its most pure expression of the divine principle of forming order in the world. In modern times, the idea of an empire has a somewhat negative connotation, as we may think of a greedy government out to conquer new territory and exploit people and resources for purely selfish material gain. But the traditional idea of the empire is about bringing dharma to the world. Thus, the king with an imperial vision would have been known by all surrounding states as a benevolent ruler, and any invasion by him would be welcome. He would not be coming to plunder, but to bring law and order, and he would only absorb those regions that he felt were of sufficient quality that such law and order could be applied, so that the people could help to embody the imperial dharmic principle. Being absorbed into such an empire would have been an honor and an improvement in the lives of the people. Such empires have been rare in history, and Evola refers to them as imperial peaks, dharmic mountains that, while separated by significant differences in application, geography, and time in the world of becoming, can still see each other from their lofty summits. Evola says, ideally one same line runs from the traditional idea of law and state to that of empire. In other words, this means that the empire is the full and complete flowering of law and state. It is the principle that has been distilled and concentrated in a more profound, pure, and complete way. It has the same lineage as the traditional law and state, but is a more perfect manifestation of it, although the form that manifestation takes is determined by matter and time. For example, the historical context, the genetic nature of the people, whether or not a stable state and culture already exists from which it can grow, environmental factors resulting in abundance or famine, a time of peace or of war, or any number of other factors. In any case, the empire is a symbol of the forces of Logos holding back the forces of chaos. The divine cosmic order flows in an unbroken line from God to the king, to the law, to the state, and finally to the empire. Evola briefly mentions the legend of Alexander the Great building an iron wall to hold back the peoples of Gog and Magog. This legend has parallels in other cultures, and in the tale of Alexander the Great, Gog and Magog are variously referred to as lands, people, or individuals, but in all cases they represent that demonic, earthly, chaotic element of nature, often portrayed as uncivilized, barbaric, or subhuman in some way. The Iron Wall is a representation of the protection the Empire offers against such destructive forces. Safe inside the wall, the citizens could enjoy relative peace and focus their energy on activities of a transcendent nature. Thus, this is connected to the idea that the Empire functions as a way of ensuring mystical salvation. The order of the cosmos will not end so long as the Empire stands, as there can be no order without the state. The cosmic will seeks order, and there must be structure to hold back chaos. Evola remarks that this concept was echoed in the idea that the world would not end so long as the Roman Empire existed. in which the world is understood not in physical terms, but in terms of representing the cosmos. The empire can be thought of as a reflection of the image of heaven. It is willed and preordained by God, and the king, as we have discussed in previous episodes, is the manifestation of God on earth. One cannot achieve a superior dignity without the structure that law and state provide, and Evola says the empire is intended as a remedium contras infirmitatem peccati, that is, a cure for the disease of sin. Through the king and the empire, with divinely mandated laws, the fallen nature of humanity could be straightened and set right on a path to eternal salvation and union with God. One might wonder, what went so wrong that these great and benevolent kings of old have degenerated into selfish, power-hungry tyrants? Evola says Dante was correct in talking about the emperor as one who, owning everything and no longer wishing for anything else, is free of concupiscence, and who can therefore allow peace and justice to reign, and thus strengthen the active life of his subjects. After the original sin, this life can no longer resist the seductions of cupiditas unless a higher power controls it and directs it. However, Evola also says that Dante did not go far enough in his diagnosis of the problem, for Dante could not see beyond the material plane. He says that Dante did not understand that the emperor's perfect possession must be of an inner nature, of those who are, that is, those who are grounded in being, but rather that Dante saw it as merely a territorial possession. Further, the cupiditas, the greed that Dante saw as problematic, was a greed simply tied to competing for earthly wealth and power, rather than as being the state that is at the root of our samsaric existence in the world of becoming, where we live in a constant state of insufficiency, always desiring more than we have, no matter our circumstances. As the passage of time has drawn our world ever deeper into a state of becoming, so far fallen away from the divine that it seems impossible that we could ever find our way back, it would be easy to despair. We may think of what a beautiful world we could have had, or perhaps once did have, and feel as though we have lost too much, that our modern world is too far gone. It would be easy to wallow in negativity and to feel as though there's no point in trying to restore order to the world. And yet, we still have so much time. Instead of despairing over our disappointing society, feeding our anger and resentment over our dissatisfaction with the world and the people in it, we should turn our focus to our own integral living and revolt against the modern world by changing the ontological nature of our being. Through our thoughts, actions, and mastery of ourselves, we can convert this modern progressive poison into medicine and transmute the lead of the Kali Yuga into gold. In the absence of a true king and a traditional state to give us the needed structure to seek transcendence, we must find our homeland in the idea which comes from an expression of the divine, supreme cosmic order that governs all that is.
laws of God, ordained divine, cosmic trust, invoked in man and mind, regality, the state